During the early 1960s, a time in which civil rights became a prominent issue nationwide, the children of Birmingham, Alabama saw this tragedy as an opportunity to right the wrongs committed against their community. Since this display of youth empowerment within ethnic minorities, debates on the morality of segregation reached the government, leading them to sign the Civil Rights Act of 1964, thus abolishing the tragedies of the past and triumphantly marching into the future. The Children's Crusade of 1963, Chasing a Change. Birmingham, Alabama, commonly referred to as the most segregated city in the nation at the time, was a prime location to begin desegregation movements. Despite a 40% black population, a majority of the city officials and highly ranked employees were white, while the black community was subject to manual labor occupations, inherently placing them lower on the economic scale. As the 20th century progressed, multiple organizations emerged in the South to counter the tragedies of segregation and racism, such as the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC. This group, directed by James Bevel, a minister and leader of the civil rights movement, was founded to facilitate and coordinate nonviolent protests in Birmingham. Meanwhile, the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights was founded for similar reasons and targeted their campaigns in Birmingham. Their leader, Fred Shuttlesworth, encouraged Martin Luther King Jr. and the SCLC to come to Birmingham to help their civil rights movement, claiming that, if you win in Birmingham, as Birmingham goes, so goes the nation. Together, these three planned a project that would change the course of the civil rights movement. Although these groups tried to improve the ingrained racist mindset at the time, Birmingham's leadership ultimately blocked these dreams from becoming a reality. Many members of the community and public leaders strongly supported segregation. Even though governors were obligated to reflect and convey the opinions of the people, they continued to disregard African Americans and their fight for equality. George Wallace, the governor at the time, heavily supported segregation and continued to oppose integration throughout his term.
I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
In addition, the Public Safety Commissioner at the time, Eugene Bull Connor, strongly opposed the rising campaigns for desegregation. He was known for his extremely violent tactics and merciless counters to peaceful protests conducted by the black community. With the support of MLK, Bevel and Shuttlesworth began planning Birmingham's most influential program, Project C for Confrontation. Their methods were centered around the fact that Bull Connor would respond to any sort of opposition with extreme violence. To use this to their advantage, these groups decided to incorporate children into their demonstrations, as they knew that if the city officials countered with violence, it would spark national sympathy and attention for the black community in Birmingham. Thus, they began planning D-Day, an event in which children would march in the streets and fill up the jails to the extent at which there was no more space for prisoners, and the officials would be forced to give in. The decision to involve children was influenced by multiple reasons, one of which being that children in jail would not affect their family's economic situation with their employers. Many adults faced economic threats and reprisals from their employers as the civil rights movement began gaining traction, leading them to resent the campaign as they believed it was only making the situation worse. In the days leading up to D-Day, the SCLC held workshops to prepare the children for the terrors that lay ahead, such as vicious dogs, brutal beatings from the police, and objects being thrown at them from bystanders. In spite of the fear they felt, the children of Birmingham were eager to participate in a triumphant display of courage that would take matters into their own hands and right the tragedies of segregation. On May 2, 1963, the first day of the Children's March, youth aged from 6 to 18 years old were instructed to go downtown and march around the buildings until they got arrested. Slowly, the streets began to fill with students walking and singing hymns and freedom songs, such as "We Shall Overcome." They clapped their hands and laughed while being arrested and awaiting transport to jail. By the end of the day, more than 1,200 students were arrested, the youngest one being 8 years old. Despite the tragic rebuttal, they sparked attention and created inspiration as their story made it to the front page of many news outlets. On May 3, 1963, the second day of the Children's March, the mood shifted and the responses became brutal. Bull Connor spontaneously ordered that the city's fire hoses be set to a level that would separate brick and mortar, and as they aimed these high-pressure water hoses at the children, it ripped the hair off their heads and the clothes off their bodies.
I hear the water behind me. Within a few minutes, I watched it go to pieces on the ground and whip my linen shoes from my feet. I'm up and I'm down and rushed at this wall. They got me. I didn't get away. I couldn't get away, and I can run.
Later, police officials were ordered to bring out German shepherds, who began biting and clawing at the children. However, Bevel continued to mentor them with methods of peace, saying that if any cops get hurt, they will lose this fight. Over the next few days, protests continued and escalated as more and more children were being locked up.
What did they do? They got increasingly violent and threatened and carried out those threats in multiple ways.
By May 7th, the number of jailed protesters had grown to over 2,500. At this point, the Children's March made national headlines and initiated a debate on civil rights around the country. The inhumane methods used by the police to quell the protesters caused strong reactions nationwide, thus forcing city leaders and business owners to integrate stores and hire more African Americans in their workforce. By June of 1963, the city began desegregating, step by step. On September 15, 1963, just a few months after the march, 4 white supremacists bombed the east side of 16th Street Baptist Church, the rendezvous point for the Children's March, instantly killing 4 girls. With attention already turned towards Birmingham, this tragedy garnered national outrage and further contributed to the public shift of opinion towards racism. The increasing national support for civil rights led President Kennedy to give the report to the American people on civil rights, proposing a legislation and speaking in favor of equality and desegregation. After generations of tragic hardships and few triumphs, Lyndon B. Johnson passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 on July 2nd, just over a year after the Children's March in Birmingham, Alabama. This historic legislation outlawed discrimination while prohibiting racial segregation in public facilities. The Children's March established a precedent of peaceful protesting for equality, not only within racial minorities, but also with young Americans who fight for free speech. In response to multiple shootings against unarmed African Americans in the 21st century, African Americans organized a movement to bring awareness to this issue that plagued the nation.
It's very important that young black people are out. This is again the same young black people from the 60s, just now, a new name, and a bolder set of issues.
The civil rights movement laid a strong foundation upon which the Black Lives Matter campaign spread through social media and peaceful demonstrations around the country. Similar to how many people opposed the marches of the past, this crusade continues to face those who disagree with their goals and methods of spreading their message.
So I think the civil rights movement helped to nudge the country towards a more open and accepting venue for people of all races and creeds.
Although the Civil Rights Act significantly desegregated the United States, some forms of segregation continue to oppress minorities today. Throughout the country, there are communities where racial minorities and those with less income are separated from others in poorer neighborhoods.
People who it hurts most are people who are already vulnerable, who didn't really have power to decide their fate. And those people in this country for the longest time have been Black people. They continue to be affected most over and over and over and over again.
The Children's Crusade of Birmingham, Alabama in 1963 had a lasting impact on not only the racially charged areas, but the nation itself. Although the marchers experienced many hardships in their fight for equality, their sacrifice and bravery resulted in a nationwide wave of acceptance of people of color. These tragic offenses of racism and discrimination prominent at the time sparked a conversation and campaign for civil rights in which people of all ages could triumphantly gain equality. After facing numerous hurdles and heartache, the calm demeanor the marchers carried in the front lines of violence created a lasting model for many more peaceful demonstrations to come. Even though tragedy often leaves collateral damage, these events are simply the cobblestones that pave the way to triumph.